Bruno Silva is going to try and appeal his UFC Atlantic City loss. He said Chris Weidman acted in bad faith with multiple eye pokes. We're going to be talking about that in this video because, quite frankly, there were so many things that failed Bruno Silva, from the referee to the athletic commission afterwards to the UFC not giving him his win bonus. Plus, he's probably going to be having long-term health damage because eyeballs, quite frankly, just do not heal the way the rest of the body does. That's what we're going to be covering in this video. Let's get right into it. Silva, he had his eyes torn out by the absolute dog, Chris Weidman, on Saturday night, right? And Weidman has gone ahead and saying, like, this is just what happens. This is just what happens in a fight, especially in fights where you're fighting with your fingers out. He literally said, this is just what happens when you're fighting with your fingers out. Like, yeah, Chris, don't you think so? It's also wild that Ray Longo went on the Kenny Florian and John Anik podcast and talked about how it was just a great fight and Chris Weidman was going to win anyway, according to what he saw, and that his coach, Chris Weidman's coach, was very, very happy with what he saw. What the hell is going on over in Weidman's corner over there? Firstly, when it comes to this, right? When it comes to talking about fighting with your fingers out, this is obviously what happens when you hold your fingers forward towards your opponent, especially when you're doing it during the entire fight. And that's why in the locker room, the referee will go to each fighter before the fight starts and say that I'm going to give you one stern warning in the cage and then a point deduction if you choose to fight with your fingers out. Now, the referee for this fight was Gary Copeland, and he didn't do any of those things during the fight. I am hoping and assuming he at least went to the locker room before the fight started to give the fighters their pre-fight warning. Essentially, what that is doing by giving the fighters their pre-fight warning is giving them the right to choose between fighting with their fingers out and risking getting a point deduction, or pulling their fingers in and range finding with a closed fist, which is totally up to the fighter on whether or not they want to take that risk on losing a point, and also whether or not they are risking another fighter's eyesight by sticking their fingers out. So Weidman's saying, like, oh, it's okay, this is just what happens when you're in a fight where people are stretching out their fingers, when he's the one that is stretching out his fingers, is almost like saying, yeah, people die when you drink and drive, when you're the one choosing to get drunk and then go driving. It's crazy talk. It honestly, it sounds like he is just purposefully creating a problem that he knows he's going to run into, and he's just lucky that he had an inexperienced referee around him when that problem went down. And then, of course, the next thing is the coach having the courage to get up and say that he's happy with what he saw from Weidman and that he doesn't want to get into it too much because he thought that Weidman was going in the direction of the win anyway, which I've seen, like, not just his coach talk about this, but a lot of Chris Weidman fans talking about this online. The decision, the fight was going in Weidman's direction because he immediately started implementing a Daniel Cormier level of striking. He immediately started implementing old school John Jones levels of striking, just stretching out his fingers from the get-go. So Silva is going to be appealing this, which is great because he should, number one, he's lost half of his purse by losing this fight, yeah? And he lost the fight because of the incompetence from a new referee that was, quite frankly, overworked that night. Did we notice how many fights Gary Copeland was actually on during that fight night card, right? GSP used to talk about this, where you would overwhelm somebody's senses by constantly, heavily faking at them to the point where their mind just couldn't simply deal with the amount of information that was coming at them, and they started to slow down their decision making, right? And I think we've all experienced this, a level of burnout at work during a long shift, especially work where you're doing a lot of mental work. You do start to feel a lot of burnout, right? And this has implications for MMA referees that are constantly judging fights over a 6 or a 7 hour shift, yeah? And they are dealing with other people's long-term health. It's not just some simple job where you make a mistake and it's okay, we can move on and go back and fix it. You're dealing with fighters' long-term health, when you're making mistakes in the cage. Early in the night, Gary Copeland was dealing with eye pokes, and he dealt with them really, really well. He gave the fighter plenty of time. He gave a hard warning to the opponent. He kept reminding the fighter who had gotten eye poked that he had the full 5 minutes to take his time and recover. He didn't do any of that during the Chris Weidman fight, right? And it does seem like Gary Copeland, he was refereeing almost every second fight on the card. We kept seeing him come back and come back. It was a constant joke running throughout Twitter during the entire fight night of like, who is this jacked up referee? And it does raise the question, how many fights per night should a referee be reffing, right? Like, what is the maximum amount of fights per night? It seemed like this guy was in there every second fight. And especially, right, for someone that we have not seen in the UFC before. For someone who is an untested referee to throw them into UFC Atlantic City to referee what seemed like over half the card, seems like we were setting ourselves up to create a problem like this. So then you go back to Bruno Silva wanting to take this one and get it overturned. And it's, at what point should the commission overturn a fight? I mean, at what point is having the rules fail you, the referee fail you? At what point in this system of checks and balances do the commission become irrelevant? Because surely this is a perfect candidate for when a fight should get turned over. And of all the fights we've ever had, this is one fight in history that should get turned over because of, well, an overworked, underexperienced, incompetent referee, and then the failing of the athletic commission when they are re-watching the slow motion, making their decision of what should happen, how should this fight end, oh, we'll take it to the judges. There were so many failures in the steps of getting to this decision, which has led to Bruno Silva not getting his fight purse, plus the physical damage of his eyes, which do not heal. There is so much that goes into this not just affecting his fight purse for this week, but carrying him forward into future fights. And Bruno taking this decision to the appeals court and trying to get it overturned, there is a good chance that it will not get overpeeled because the commissions are less than useless, right? And there is a great opportunity here for the UFC to win a cheap and easy PR marketing strategy. There are so many people in the MMA world that hate the UFC because they feel like they underpay their fighters. They're even going to get angry at me for using the words, feel like they underpay their fighters. And these are people that are in our sport, that like MMA. The UFC spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe up to $1 million, on overall advertising for the entire year to try and bring this sport to new audiences. And there is almost a level of, you're probably aware that the UFC exists already. If you're not watching it by now, you might just never be into it. But for the UFC to win a marketing battle here, they could really make a big deal over Bruno Silva losing his win bonus and the third-party systems that the state athletic commissions that they do not control doing Bruno Silva dirty. And they could give him his win bonus. You know, whether it's 100K, 150K, whatever it is. They could just give him his win bonus. I mean, they gave a kid a bonus for getting bitten last week. They could give Bruno Silva his win bonus, and then all those people that talk about just how unfair and evil the UFC is that are in our sport would actually have something to clap at. They could actually take people who like MMA and start to draw them back over to appreciating what the UFC does for everyone in MMA, rather than trying to go and convince someone who's already seen a bunch of MMA highlights in between NFL commercials and isn't really that interested in it. That to me would seem like a much greater return on investment than trying to win over your regular soccer fan over in Europe. So that's the thoughts on that. Good luck to Bruno Silva getting this one overturned. What do you think? Should that fight get overturned? Do you think the MMA community is even going to remember this going forward? When you start to see people pick Bruno Silva's next fight, are they even going to talk about this? Or are they just going to talk about how he's coming off a loss against Chris Weidman? He couldn't even beat Chris Weidman. Because sometimes when fighters miss weight or a robbery decision doesn't go their way, the MMA world just tends to move on, and fighters start to get picked against it because of that. They just don't remember it. So what do you think? Should this fight get overturned? Do you think people are even going to remember this going past into next week? If you enjoyed this video, go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and of course, I'll see you all in the next one.